Thank God he didn't come.
That was my daughter's toast at her own wedding the moment I realized I wasn't a father in her story anymore, just an obstacle to be removed. I walked out without a word, went home, and turned grief into evidence. One envelope, one recording, one truth at a time. What followed wasn't revenge, it was accountability, with signatures. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back. Be part of the experience. If a moment grabs you, powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp and your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate most. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. I live on the southern shoulder of the Blue Ridge in a cedar-sided house that leans into the wind like an old friend. The porch boards remember my boots. The porch swing remembers my weight. Most mornings I tune the battered Philco radio to a station that still believes in violins, and I drink black coffee while the light climbs out of the gorge. People in town still call me Principal Whitaker, though I retired 2 years ago. I answer to Sam, 64 and still stubborn about the little things, how tomatoes should taste, how a promise should sound, how a door should close. Marjorie, my wife, taught me most of that. Pancreatic cancer took her fast, as if a tide pulled back without warning and never returned. She left a neat house, a mess of grief, and a habit I cannot shake. When something doesn't fit, write it down. I keep a narrow notebook in the kitchen drawer with the rubber bands and coupon scissors. A scribble can be a lifeline. My daughter, Cassandra, cast to me, works in Charlotte as a financial advisor. 36, quick with numbers and quicker with that smile that happens more in her eyes than at her mouth. She looks terrific in navy suits. It's a fact and a strategy. After Marge's funeral, Cass stood in our kitchen with spreadsheets on her phone and said I should consider selling the house to liberate cash flow, a phrase that felt like a crowbar against my ribs. I told her this roof wasn't a ledger line. She believed herself practical. I believed myself anchored. Neither of us convinced the other. The wedding invitation came 6 weeks late, forwarded from my old address in Ohio, where we lived before the mountains got into our bones. The envelope was cream, the font was tremulous, and the note inside was brief. Would love to have you there, Dad. If it's hard to make it, I understand. I stared at those polite words until they felt like a locked gate. Still, I circled the date. Reed Mercer is the man Cass is marrying, a polished voice for a faith-based, freedom-from-debt program that sells tidy hope in tidy installments. I don't doubt his sincerity, but sincerity isn't a bridge. It's a coat you put on for weather. I met him once, long enough to see him measure a room while he spoke, the way a pitcher checks base runners. On the morning I left, the Philco hummed through static as if to ask whether I was sure. I loaded a duffel and a garment bag into the truck, locked the front door, tested it twice, and told the porch I'd be back. Asheville slid behind me. Art galleries, breweries, the Vance Monument now gone, but still an empty itch in the skyline. And the interstate unrolled like a tape measure. North Carolina yielded to Tennessee, then Arkansas, then the long angles of New Mexico. I ate gas station peanuts and orange wedges and let the road think for me. By the time I found a motel off I-25, the sky was the color of new brews. I slept in my boots because sleep unbuttons me now and then, and I didn't trust the alarm. At dawn, I was already driving, sage hovering just above the ground like a rumor. Santa Fe rose into view all at once, adobe walls the color of bread crust, turquoise doors, strings of papel picado waiting for wind. Cass had chosen a ranch outside town with paper lanterns bobbing like moons on a line and a bar pouring local wine into glasses that looked too thin for desert air. I parked away from the valets and walked the path of crushed stone, the sound under my soles like someone whispering the word almost. The courtyard was a soft clamor, ice in buckets, a guitar somewhere, laughter that knew it was being heard. I saw her before she saw anything but her day. Cass stood beneath an arch of river willow in a sleeveless ivory dress that turned sunlight into something quiet. She held herself the way she holds a closing argument. steady and centered, as if gravity were an ally she'd negotiated with in advance. Reed was near her shoulder, guiding a couple toward a photographer. The scene arranged itself, and I wasn't in it. I moved into the long shade of an adobe wall, close enough to see the fabric's grain, far enough to be a story someone else would tell later. A man arrived, then thought better of it. I could have lifted my hand. I could have called her name. Instead, I stood with the air in my lungs and a single wish in my mouth. One hug, nothing fancy, the kind a daughter gives her father to say, "You still belongs." The desert has its own incense. Wind slid through with the smell of sagebrush, clean and slightly bitter, and for a second I was in two places: the courtyard where paper lanterns nodded, and my porch where marigolds tilted their small suns toward mine. A server passed with a tray, glasses chiming like careful bells. Somewhere a cameraman counted down. I stepped closer to the threshold and felt my heart remember the pendulum clock in my living room. Swing and click, a faithful metronome that had kept our years in time. "Just a minute," I whispered, though no one had asked. I told myself it wasn't doubt, only patience. If I measured this next breath correctly, I would cross the tile, find Cass's shoulder between congratulations, and say what mattered: that I was proud, that her mother would have loved the dress, that I had come because fathers come even when asked nicely not to. The moment tensed like a bowstring. I lifted my chin and stepped out of the shade, the sagey wind pressing a cool palm against my cheek. Ahead of me, the crowd shifted, a flock changing shape. The officiant laughed with someone near the bar, and a cluster of guests turned, lifting their glasses high as if an invisible cue had prompted them. The air gathered itself for words. I breathed once, then again, and walked toward the sound of glass on glass. Glass on glass rang out like a small bell choir, the sound bright enough to draw every face toward the courtyard center. Paper lanterns trembled on their strings. I slipped a half step from the adobe shade and saw my daughter raise her flute. The desert wind came through with the clean, bitter edge of sagebrush, and for a breath I could smell my porch 2,000 miles away. Cass stood where the light was kind to her, ivory dress skimming her shoulders, the posture of a woman who believed the moment would obey. She thanked the planner, the photographer, the friends who'd flown in on red-eyes, the pastor who'd made room in his calendar, the board members from the nonprofit. The cadence was practiced but not cold. I felt a foolish surge of pride because performance had always been easy for her and empathy required work. This sounded like a hand stretched outward. Then the hand withdrew. "Today," she said, lifting her glass a fraction higher, "begins without the old complications." Laughter rippled like a tide. A man at the VIP table, tan cufflinks that winked, leaned toward his neighbors and let a line slip just loud enough to carry. "Thank God he didn't come." The chuckles found their footing and grew. I knew exactly who he meant. I knew it the way you know rain is coming when the swallows drop lower over the field. The breath I'd hoarded cooled in my chest. My fingers loosened on the air as if I'd been holding a doorknob that was never going to turn. There are ways to make a scene, and there are ways to make a life. I put the flute I hadn't sipped on a high table and walked the edge of the crowd, hugging the wall's long curve until the lantern light fell behind me. The hallway was a tunnel of shadow and stucco. My footsteps softened on tile, then clicked over brick, then thudded on packed earth. Outside, the evening gathered around the parking lot's crushed stone. Red brake lights smudged the dust like watercolor. In the rear view of a rented SUV, the party flipped itself. Lanterns became red comets, guests a shoal of silhouettes. The desert's cool arrived all at once. It lifted the hair at the back of my neck and laid a palm on my cheek as if to say, enough. Gravel complained under my shoes as I crossed to the truck. I unlocked it, then rested both hands on the roof the way men do when they need the metal to steady what the ribcage won't. Some part of me, small but insistent, wished she'd rush out calling my name, break the spell with an ordinary apology. The rest of me knew I had been carefully edited out. On the highway, the sky bruised toward purple again. I passed the city's edge, the last galleries, a line of adobe bungalows with blue doors, and found a motel near I-25 with a vacancy sign that buzzed like a trapped wasp. The lobby smelled of chlorine and citrus cleaner. My room contained a bed that squeaked, a nightstand with a Gideon Bible, a table with a faux wood top, and an air conditioner that coughed every 9 minutes. I set my wallet, keys, and phone down in a neat row, the way Marge had taught me when bad days came: order the small things, and the large might follow. In the wallet behind my driver's license, I keep her face. The photo is years old. Laugh lines, a smudge of garden soil near her left wrist, a strand of hair that never stayed where the bobby pins told it. I held it, then set it beside the Bible as if they might talk. The habit she left me rose of its own accord. If it doesn't fit, write it down. I said it aloud, then reached for the narrow notebook in my bag, the one that still smells faintly of pencil shavings and cafeteria yeast rolls. I wrote 3 lines: empty toast. Old complications. Laughter at "thank God he didn't come." The laptop woke to the motel's soft lamp glow and asked for a guest Wi-Fi password printed on a card with a cactus on it. My email inflated with the day's dust. Coupons, alumni newsletters, a student from long ago asking for a reference. 3 subject lines sat together like guilty cousins: confirmation, beneficiary, update. Each stamped as read, each addressed to me, each from a financial firm I recognize because it holds my retirement. I hadn't opened them. The timestamp on the first was 10 days ago, the second last week, the third yesterday afternoon. I scrolled, hoping for an obvious explanation that would stand up in daylight. There wasn't one. I dialed the bank. A syrupy recorded voice thanked me for calling, then a different voice apologized for unusually high call volume, then a music loop tried to convince me this was normal. I lasted 12 minutes, hung up, tried again, lasted 9, hung up. I wrote another line in the notebook: bank lines jammed. The motel air conditioner coughed and the lamp flickered politely. I pulled Marge's small spiral from my duffel, the one with the elastic band around its middle. She kept recipes in there and nursery plans and emergency phone numbers written twice, once in pen and once in pencil. At the back, behind a card with a sauce for chicken that I never did master, something rasped against the cardboard. An envelope slid free. On the front, in her tidy teacher's print, was a sentence that landed like a fingertip on my sternum. When our child confuses you, start here. I didn't open it, not because I was afraid of what was inside, though of course I was. I didn't open it because the act would belong to a different day, and today had already spent itself showing me where I stood. I placed the envelope on the table, aligned with the edge, then pulled my chair in close as if proximity could be a kind of preparation. Outside, a semi downshifted on the interstate and a siren stitched itself briefly to the night. I lifted the photo of Marge again and tried to match my breath to her smile's tempo. Somewhere in Santa Fe, under swinging lanterns, a DJ would be dialing up something joyful. Somewhere in that courtyard, my daughter might be staring at the far wall, wishing the one thing she'd wished away had learned how to vanish without a sound. I did what I could do. I dated the page, underlined the 3 lines, and drew a box around the word beneficiary until the ink bled. Then I closed the notebook and set it atop the envelope. The day had announced itself in careful language and small humiliations. It wasn't only the day my presence failed to clear the threshold, it was the day my hand found the first thread and felt it give. Morning peeled the motel room open with a weak beige light that made every surface look tired. I set the Bible aside, placed Marge's envelope in the center of the faux wood table, and traced the ridge of her handwriting with my thumb. The flap lifted with the quiet of a church door. Paper still remembered her. A faint scent of talc and peppermint rose like a blessing. On top lay a document I recognized in shape but not in consequence, a springing power of attorney from our Ohio years. My signature sat where it always had, but Marge had underlined the limiting clause in neat blue pen, effective only upon independent medical evaluation. That single adjective, independent, stood on the page like a guard at a gate. She had written in the margin, "Never let anyone turn a bad day into incompetent." I read it twice, then a third time, and felt the line draw a circle around me. Beneath the POA sat a checklist in Marge's tidy block letters. my IRA custodian and account number, the 529 we had opened for a grandchild we hoped to meet, and the whole life policy she had insisted on keeping through retirement. Next to each, she had added small weather reports. Beneficiary confirmed. Do not change while you are of sound mind. In the margins, she had drawn boxes, empty, waiting for me to fill with proof. I opened my laptop and worked the slow Wi-Fi until the portfolio windows loaded. Transactions unfurled like receipts off an old cash register. A pattern blinked. On my checking account, a trail of charitable micro-gifts to Cedar Path Fellowship stacked up to $9,800. $83.50 here, $117 there, $146.25 on a Sunday night, each just under the tripwire that makes software sniff for fraud. I hadn't authorized a penny. The neat cruelty wasn't the size, it was the camouflage. I searched my inbox and found a separate nettle. An email from a private clinic in Charlotte thanking me for initiating a cognitive assessment. I hadn't. The message included a case ID, an appointment window, and a cheerful reminder to bring supporting family. Its timestamp sat uncomfortably close to the wedding week. I copied the headers, the number, the case ID, and wrote them into my notebook with the steadiness I used to bring to discipline hearings. By early afternoon, I was back in Asheville, climbing the stairs to a second-floor office that smelled like dry erase marker and fresh copy paper. Pilar Navarro did not waste furniture on pretension. She had a clean desk, a whiteboard scattered with statute numbers, and a bulletin board of thank you cards from people who probably still called her at odd hours. I laid out the POA, Marge's checklist, the bank printouts, the clinic email, and watched the practice calm of her face tighten by increments. This is the guardianship playbook, she said, tapping the clause I had already loved. Manufacture confusion, commission a friendly evaluation, ask a court to appoint a temporary guardian to protect you from your own finances. Once a judge signs, access becomes a key in the wrong pocket. She slid a legal pad toward me. From this minute, assume everything is exhibit material. Label, date, preserve. Don't text anger, write facts. Her advice fit me like an old jacket. On my phone, I installed a recorder that would capture both sides of a call. In my notebook, I opened a page titled Chain of Custody and created columns for date, time, file name, and summary. I wrote the first line with a small private satisfaction. Marge envelope opened. POA, springing, account list, beneficiary notes. Pilar asked about Cedar Path Fellowship. I told her it was Reed's church-adjacent community trust, a phrase with too many soft edges. She frowned and handed me a card. Call Deshaun Price. He's quick on public records and dirt that pretends to be dust. Deshaun answered on the third ring, voice bright, like a student who enjoyed a pop quiz. I gave him the basics. He promised a fast scrape, IRS, nonprofit database, state filings, merchant processors, anything visible on the surface web without a subpoena. I returned to the whiteboard while Pilar sketched a timeline. Funeral, house sale pressure, late invitation, Santa Fe, toast, retreat, motel, emails, Marge's envelope, and now. Lines connected events until the shape resembled something deliberate rather than unlucky. My phone vibrated before I reached the door. Deshaun's first text stacked 3 short sentences like railroad ties. No 501C3 for Cedar Path. Crypto wallets listed on donation page. Payment rails show North Fork Processing, LLC, Wyoming. The combination bothered me. Charity without charity status. Donations with volatility instead of receipts. A processor tucked into a state that loved boxes with nothing inside. Driving home, the desert scene replayed and snapped into a different order. Thank God he didn't come was not only a cruelty, it was step 0, a social erasure to soften the ground before legal erasure. If the crowd accepts you as absent, a judge will find it easier to accept you as incapable. I said it aloud in the cab, an old teacher rehearsing for clarity. Erase the person, then erase the signature. I parked under the hemlock, carried my folders inside, and staged my kitchen like an evidence lab. Each document got a sticky note with a letter and a number. Each call I made wore a file name with the date. I watched the recorder's red dot the way you watch a newborn breathe. At dusk, Deshaun called back, breath in his voice as if he had jogged to the phone. "One more thing," he said. "Cedar Path shows outgoing payments to a local hospice billing company in your wife's final month. Small amounts, split across weeks. Your wife's policy should have covered those I pinched the bridge of my nose to keep my eyes from swimming." "Then why would Cedar Path pay?" His answer was a clean cut. "If someone engineered denials, a charity payment launders the story. Look how generous we are covering what insurance wouldn't. It also makes an audit ask fewer questions." I wrote the words exactly as he said them, then drew a black square around the phrase engineered denials until the paper thinned. Grief is a fog when it's new, but after a while it becomes a lens. Through it I could finally see the shape I was tracing. A steady siphon with pious language painted on the pipe. Before bed I made a list on Pilar's yellow pad. 1. Export 6 months of bank and card statements. Save PDFs. Print hard copies. 2. Call clinic. Request intake packet. Demand basis for initiated assessment. Record the call. 3. Freeze external transfers. Add passphrases that only Marge would know. 4. Send Deshaun beneficiary confirmations for IRA 529 and whole life. Verify custodians. 5. Log every contact with Cass and Reed. No improvisation, no arguments. Questions only. I placed the springing POA on top of the stack, its single necessary word facing up. Independent. It felt like a hand at my back. I clicked the recorder off, capped my pen, and turned the kitchen light to low. From now on, life would move by rules I understood. Label, date, preserve, ask, verify, escalate. I was done being a ghost at the edge of a courtyard. The next time someone lifted a glass on my account, it would be to read a file number into the record. South End at noon always sounds like silverware rehearsing for a concert. I arrived early anyway, chose a corner table with a brick wall at my back, and set my phone on the bread plate as if I were expecting a call. The recorder app pulsed a discrete red dot. I wrote the time, date, and location in my chain of custody notebook, then tested the acoustics with a throat clear aimed at the center of the room. The echo came back clean. Cass swept in first, hair pinned into a tidy knot that said agenda more than celebration. Reed followed with the confidence of a man who believes every chair is already pulled out for him. A third person trailed them, a woman in a cardigan with a name badge and a tote bag printed with a tree of life. She introduced herself as a geriatric counselor, voice padded and professional. I repeated their names once, casual as small talk, to set them on the tape. The menu became theater. We ordered salads because lunch with an agenda always wants to look light. The counselor began with a pamphlet about grief, the kind with watercolor leaves and bullet points. She described how bereavement can nick short-term memory and widen forgetfulness into something like uncertainty. I smiled and nodded, and when she asked me to recall 5 simple words, I wrote them on my napkin, then swapped the order on purpose. When she slid over a clock drawing test, I put the hands together at 11 and wrote 11 o'clock beneath them, as if translating between languages had tired me. Cass leaned in. She was all concern, a performance so close to the real thing it hurt to watch. She spoke about safety, about falls in older houses, about the loneliness that can turn a large place hollow. She placed a glossy brochure for independent living beside my water glass, the kind with wide hallways and a dog on a patio. Reed timed his entry with the ease of a practiced MC. He produced a 1-page form titled Limited Financial Power of Attorney, Temporary, and set a pin on top as if gravity might finish the signature. He added a trifold piece for Cedar Path Fellowship, all mission-driven facades in cheerful fonts, promising 12% returns from real estate that blesses underserved neighborhoods. I asked about licensing and audits the way a teacher asks about homework, gentle but with a rubric in mind. Do you file a Form 990? Are you registered with the state? Who audits your books? Reed's vocabulary performed calisthenics, stewardship, umbrella partners, donor-advised frameworks, and landed nowhere you could plant a flag. He said it was a community trust, not an investment fund, so the language of regulation was beside the point. I let silence do what cross-examination used to do for me. He filled it with warmth that never quite got warm. The counselor returned to safety. She mentioned that a short-term assessment could help everyone breathe easier. Cass touched the limited POA form with 2 fingers as if it were fragile and said we could sign, just for now. I told them I would like to take the documents home for review and wait for that breath. Reed pivoted to cheerful, then to disappointed, the way weather does in spring. Cass's eyes flicked to the counselor, then back to me, and for a moment her mouth softened into something like the girl who used to ask me to check the monsters under her bed. Strategy slid back over it like a shade. The server left the check, I paid with cash and requested receipts. On the sidewalk, the sun reflected off glass towers and went for my corneas. I stepped into the lee of a planner, named and saved the audio file with a timestamp, and wrote a summary while the phrases were still warm. Limited POA, 12%, independent living, safety, community trust. The red dot on the recorder turned gray, my pulse steadied. Pilar's office felt like a library that had passed the bar. She put on headphones and closed her eyes the way some people pray. Every few minutes she tapped spacebar, rewound, and wrote a time code on a legal pad. When the counselor said screen, Pilar underlined. When Reed said temporary, she circled. When Cass said just for now, she drew a thin arrow to supporting documentation. She removed the headphones and spoke in the tone she uses when telling hard truths without varnish. They had constructed a public, seemingly benign intervention designed to produce paperwork a court could understand as protective. If a judge later heard that a counselor had concerns, that I had struggled with a memory screen, that my daughter had stepped in with a limited power of attorney, the tunnel would already be dug. "They're building a legal tunnel straight into your retirement," she said, and slid the pad across to me. My phone chimed. Deshawn had sent a string of images and notes. Reed in a county fairground meeting room in Tennessee, a banner with the words Harvest Steward Trust, a county clerk's dissolution filing 3 years later citing insufficient assets to continue. Another photo showed a church basement with folding chairs and a whiteboard labeled New Hope Growth Fund, followed by a short article from a local paper about congregants seeking answers when the fund ran dry. No criminal charges on public record, but a smell you couldn't Febreze away. I printed the photos and stapled the notes with my name on the corner as if to claim custody. Back home, the evening tugged the light down the hill. I cleared the kitchen table and made it into a staging area. Left stack for audio transcripts, right stack for brochures and forms, middle for Pilar's memo. I wrote Whitaker v. Whitaker et al. On a binder spine and felt a curious steadiness seat itself in my chest. The phrase wasn't a threat, it was a posture. The principal in me had returned and he had a red pen. I hole-punched the limited POA draft and slid it into a sleeve. The Cedar Path brochure went behind it, 12% circled, a question mark beside every testimonial without a last name. I photographed the counselor's memory screen and saved it with a file name that began with today's date. I tucked the lunch receipt into a pocket and made a copy. The chain of custody page grew a new line for each item, my handwriting even and small. The ritual did not cheat the ache in my ribs, but it gave the ache somewhere to stand. In the quiet that follows a day like that, you can hear what the heart mutters when it thinks you've stopped listening. Mine said to keep going. Mine said to hold the line at the gate. Word Marge had underlined, independent. Mine said love can guide without giving quarter. I turned off the kitchen light, left the binder open to the first tab, and let the house settle around that small, precise promise. If this resonates and you're following along, drop "I'm listening" in the comments to let me know. Now let's continue. The attic keeps the kind of quiet that remembers names. Dust floated in the lamplight like handwriting paused mid-sentence, and the rafters smelled faintly of cedar from sachets Marge tucked into every box. I knelt beside her old fabric trunk, blue canvas with a fraying leather handle, and worked the zipper. Its rasp sounded like a zipper you hear in a church before a funeral. Too loud for the room and yet the only honest noise in it. Inside, everything was squared and labeled in her teacher's neat script. Photos, recipes, seed packets, winter scarves. Beneath a quilt top folded like a flag, a small pouch lay waiting. My thumb found the metal of a USB drive. Under it, bound by an elastic, sat several letters on stationery she saved for birthdays and hard truths. I carried the pouch and letters downstairs, set them on the kitchen table, and turned the laptop toward the chair Marge used to occupy when she read in the late afternoon. The drive's blue LED blinked into the room's dim. I opened a video file named in her tidy way, date first, then for Sam, and there she was. Thinner but bright-eyed, a bandana covering the scalp she had pretended didn't embarrass her. She sat at our table in good light, a mug between her palms, the old clock tick behind her like a metronome holding the measure. She didn't rehearse because she never did. She told me that twice, the word pressed gently. She had watched Cass sit at this very table and test my name on an online beneficiary form. In each case, Cass claimed she was only checking what would happen if my name moved on a screen. She said Reed had told her it was temporary, a way to protect Dad while things were unsettled. Marge didn't accuse, she documented. She described the dates, the screens, the way Cass bit her lower lip when she concentrated, the small tremor in her hand when she clicked submit and then canceled. She finished by asking me if Reed ever became formal in our lives to bring everything to Pilar Navarro because Pilar understands the safeguard in your POA. I paused the video and let the house own the sound of ticking. Grief can turn the past into a painting you stand at a respectful distance from. This brought me to the brushstrokes. I watched it again, then filed the source and a duplicate onto an external drive, labeling both with date and hash in my chain of custody notebook. The letters came next. Her pen had not wavered. One repeated the video's points with margins for my notes. Another listed accounts, IRA, 529, whole life, and reminded me to never permit a beneficiary change unless I was of sound mind and present. The last letter was instruction, not plea. If you can't read their goal, let Pilar read it for you. By late afternoon, I was back in Pilar's office, the whiteboard updated to include a new column, Marge's Materials. Pilar watched the video wearing headphones, pencil hovering for timestamps. She never fast-forwarded. When the screen darkened, she exhaled the way a diver does before telling a surface what lies beneath. She stacked my printouts, the USB and Marge's letters, then dialed Special Agent Dana Ruiz from a list she keeps for days when the law needs both state and federal jurisdictions to pay attention. Pilar recited the bones, suspected elder fraud, attempts to subvert a springing power of attorney, micro-donations to a pseudo-charity, hospice payments routed through the same. She requested a preliminary review off the record for now to preserve integrity and avoid tipping anyone into a panic. I listened to her summarize my life like a case file and felt that odd, stabilizing gratitude you feel when someone pronounces a diagnosis you already knew. The truth had a language, and she spoke it. On the way home, a text from Cass slid onto my screen, the wording careful enough to pass through almost any filter. "Dad, please don't drag strangers into family business." I took a screenshot, saved it, and wrote the time in my notebook. Then I answered with a single line. "Let's talk at Freedom Park, just us." Twilight had already lowered itself over the lake when I sat on a bench beneath the willow. The air carried the faint sweetness of cut grass, the water stitched small wind into wider ripples, and joggers passed with the courtesy of people who don't want to interrupt a private conversation they cannot help seeing. I set a manila folder beside me, the recorder on and breathing its small red light into the pocket of shadow between us. Cass arrived briskly. A jacket swung over her arm, eyes scanning the path before they softened into daughter mode. She sat without touching my sleeve. I opened the folder and slid across the printouts of charitable micro-gifts to Cedar Path Fellowship. Dates, amounts split under thresholds, a total of $9,800. I kept my voice level and my sentences short. I asked who authorized them. She said they had intended to replace the money, that Reed had assured her it was safe, that it kept me protected, that it was temporary. The words didn't trip, they rolled, and if you weren't listening for the seams, you might believe the garment whole. I didn't correct her. Silence has its uses. The leaves above us brushed one another with the whisper of paper. A mallard cut a neat line through the water, unbothered by names. Somewhere between her promise to make it right and a sentence about seniors and scams, never a category she believed I belonged to until it served the sentence, I realized I did not recognize the person speaking. Recognition is not only about the face, it's a contract about the story you believe the two of you are in. The gust that crossed the lake lifted the fine hairs at my wrist. I closed the folder and told her I would be in touch through counsel. Her mouth hardened and then relaxed as if two different scripts were fighting for the next act. She left without looking back. I watched the wake of her steps close on the path. When my phone vibrated, Pilar's voice came through with the clean edges of news that rearranges the furniture. She had reached the clinic. A name I hadn't heard rattled something in her memory. With 2 calls and a database check, she found it. Consultancy payments from Cedar Path to the very doctor who had evaluated me. The springing POA's guard word, independent, had been breached with a checkbook. Your evaluation wasn't independent, she said. It was purchased. The phrase sit in the evening like a bell that had just been struck. I wrote it down exactly as she said it, then boxed it with a heavy pen until the paper softened under the ink. When the call ended, I saved the recording from the park, copied the text from Cass, and slid everything into fresh sleeves in the binder. The spine read what it had read the night before. Whitaker versus Whitaker et al. The name no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a doorframe that fits. I turned off the kitchen light and let the house return to its learned quiet. The attic would still smell of cedar in the morning. Marge's clock would still keep time. And the next step would not be about hurting anyone back. It would be about placing each piece where the law could find it, and letting the law do what we pretend only love can. Dusk in the mountains arrives like a decision. I sat on the porch steps with the binder on my knee and thumbed the switch on the strand of cafe bulbs that crosses the eaves. Each bulb woke in sequence, a little procession of clarity. The house exhaled. I opened the laptop and let the home Wi-Fi settle into its new name, a private joke only Marge would catch, and clicked to a bookmarked page I had promised myself to watch with my teeth unclenched. Whitman Chapel's live stream came up full frame, a stage trimmed with thrift store plants, light bars washed in warm amber, a camera that loved the man in front of it. Pastor Joel spoke in cadences rounded by practice. He had a voice designed for softening edges, and he used it on a slideshow of a future that didn't yet exist. A polished 3D rendering of a mission housing campus rotated on screen, clean stucco, smiling silhouettes, a play structure with no dirt under it. A donation ticker crept along the bottom, names abbreviated into initials and hearts. I took screenshots with the reflex of a man collecting shells before the tide forgets them. Reed stood near the second camera, working the crowd between songs, the way people do when they believe the lens loves their side of the face. The pastor leaned into an appeal. We're building hope together. And the ticker jumped. I paused the stream and looked at the still frame. The rendered shadows fell the wrong direction for the room, like everything else about the pitch. Anger suggested a dozen unwise moves. I imagined forwarding the stream to a reporter I knew from school board days, posting a thread with annotated screenshots, calling the chapel a storefront for something hollow. But anger has a short battery, and I had already chosen another power source. I called Pilar. She answered from the clatter of a printer. I walked her through the live stream and my impulse to throw a match, and she walked me back. Headlines are accelerants. Records are ballast. If I wanted public pressure, we could find it. If I wanted convictions and restitution, we would hew to admissibility, timing, and patience. Headlines scorch, records convict, she said. Which do you want? I looked at the bulb strung above me, at the circle of light that did not spill past the rail. Records, I said. Then we'll build the record. We finished the retainer via secure link. I signed with the low, private relief that attends giving your weight to a rope that holds. I added Counsel Navarro to my phone and slid 2 printed copies of the engagement letter into the binder's first sleeve. On a fresh page I wrote, "Chose law," and underlined it twice. The mundanity of it steadied me. Procedure loves a system, so I gave it one. I created folders labeled by date and channel: call, text, email, screenshot, stream. I drafted a naming convention that began with YYYY-MM-DD and ended with short subjects even a stranger would understand. I set the recorder to default on for every call. My chain of custody notebook gained a new section, a daily log with time, summary, and cross-reference to the file. Nothing glamorous, but glamour doesn't testify under oath. Inside the house, I turned to locks and lenses. The old deadbolt came off with a groan, the new one clicked into place with the relief of a tooth finally seated. I reset the router, changed the admin credentials, and cut any forgotten devices at the knees. 2 small cameras went up, front door and side yard, angles checked on my phone, motion zones set to ignore the neighbor's feral cat and the maple's low branches. I opened a drawer and fished out the spare keys, then texted Eileen Park across the way. She came over in house shoes with a cardigan thrown on, the way neighbors do when they understand urgency without details. I gave her keys, souls, and the alarm code, asked for eyes on the place if she saw a car idle too long. She patted my arm and didn't try to fill the silence with comfort. Sometimes kindness is the absence of a story. Banking came next. On a recorded call, I added a passphrase built from a poem only Marge and I could recite in unison, the one about winter light and the mercy of small fires. I asked the custodian to flag my profile. Do not discuss with relatives. No external transfers without in-person authentication. Reissue cards. Reverse any standing ACH authorizations to entities that masquerade as charity. The rep read back the notes. I repeated the passphrase. The recorder captured it all. When we hung up, I printed the confirmation emails and slid them behind a tab labeled Financial Locks. The house felt different with new metal in its doors and new rules in its wires. I brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table, and took out a sheet of paper with a decal edge Marge liked for letters. I wrote to Cass and did not prepare to send it. I acknowledged the love that built our years and the harm that had stepped in as if invited. I said future contact would proceed through counsel until trust could survive exposure to daylight. I wrote that no can be an instrument of care when yes would be a permission slip for further damage. I dated the letter and placed it in a sleeve marked unsent. It was ballast, not a signal. Near midnight, I returned to the stream and let it run without sound, the way a person might observe fish moving in a tank. The donation ticker still jumped. The render still rotated. I listed phrases from the lower thirds, impact, restoration, legacy, and wondered how many of those words were covering exits. Close to dawn, my phone buzzed with a message from Deshaun. He had found a Knoxville senior, a retired priest named Father Michael O'Rourke, who had lost his home after a Cedar Path refinance reset the clock on his mortgage and then bled him during a medical leave. The man wanted to talk. Deshaun attached a courthouse docket number, a property record, and a photo of a man in a collar standing next to a U-Haul like a verdict. I logged every field and wrote down 2 questions to ask with care. The fight had always been personal, now it was properly public. I stepped back onto the porch. The cafe bulbs cast a patient puddle of light over the rail, the yard beyond held to its shadows. I closed the binder, tucked it under my arm, and stood long enough to let the mountain air stitch itself through my shirt. I wasn't shutting the door, I was turning the light on and keeping the lock set. "Turn the light on, keep the door locked," I said into the quiet, a promise to Marge and to the man whose name is on my accounts. The night blinked, then held steady. The record would grow. The knock came before the birds argued about dawn. I was already up, staring at the pale window and the thin steam curling from a kettle that hadn't yet learned to sing. Dew slicked the porch rail, air pulled cold in the hollows of the yard. When I opened the door, Cass stood with a manila stack hugged to her chest, hair pulled back without ceremony. The kind of face you put on when you intend to manage a crisis rather than survive it. She walked past me into the kitchen as if speed might keep doubt from catching up. Paper landed on the table with the flat thud of decisions made elsewhere. A petition for temporary guardianship, an appointment slip for a competency evaluation at the same cheerful clinic in Charlotte, and a letter of concern written on Whitman Chapel letterhead, all seraphed assurances and pastoral signatures. The packet smelled faintly of toner and perfume. "This is about keeping you safe," she said, low and practiced. "Temporarily." The kettle clicked over into a soft roar. I didn't answer. I set her papers in a neat row, then laid mine beside them. Marge's letter first, the springing POA with the word "independent" underlined, a printout from the IRS database showing Cedar Path Fellowship nowhere it was supposed to be, the micro-donation summary with its careful pattern of undersized gifts, the clinic email I had not initiated. The documents made two separate bar lines on the table, and the silence between them was the measure. "Independent means independent," I said, not a friend of Reed with a clipboard. Color moved under Cass's skin and then withdrew. She smoothed the corner of the chapel letter as if it might crumple into something less persuasive. Her pitch pivoted to safety, falls in old houses, the stress of bills, the dignity of planning before emergencies require it. I let her words pass like cars on a road I no longer needed to cross. When I asked about hospice billing, the small odd payments Deshawn had traced, she answered too quickly, a reflex hardened by repetition. Denials were expected, she said, so Cedar Path could help pay and keep things moving. Expected, the word nicked the air. Behind it lay the admission. What should have run through insurance had been steered outside it, where generosity could launder something else. I wrote the phrasing in my notebook without breaking her gaze. The kettle began to talk to itself. Headlights washed a moving geometry across the living room wall, and tires whispered on the gravel. I stepped to the door as an unmarked sedan and a local cruiser eased to the curb. Special Agent Dana Ruiz came up the walk with two officers, her coat unbuttoned against the mountain chill, her face set to the respectful firmness of people who do this carefully because they've seen it done badly. On the porch, she introduced herself and handed me a warrant with a number I repeated twice for the recorder. Devices and records related to Cedar Path and associated entities, names printed where air had been before. "We're executing a lawful warrant," she said. "We'll be as unobtrusive as the scope allows." The officers moved through the house with cataloger's patience. Serials read aloud, photos snapped, each item announced before it left its place. Ruiz asked Cass to accompany them downtown for a voluntary interview. The word voluntary entered the room like a chair pulled out, not for comfort, but for posture. Cass turned her face toward mine so the others could not read it. "Don't let them cuff me," she whispered. "Not before I can separate from Reed." "I won't obstruct," I said. "Everything needs to be documented." Her mouth pressed into a white line that used to be a smile when she was trying not to cry in kindergarten. For a moment, I saw the child who once crawled into our bed after a nightmare about waves. Behind her, Agent Ruiz's radio crackled, then stilled. The search went on with the untheatrical sound of zippers and Velcro. Through the window, I caught Eileen Park in her robe at the mailbox, absorbing his morning paper. She looked once, lifted a hand half an inch off her side, then turned away to give the porch its dignity. The small grace steadied the floor under my shoes. A phone in Ruiz's pocket murmured a tone meant to get attention without asking for it. She listened, then repeated the caller's phrases in a neutral register for her notes. A concurrent team at Cass's garage had found a go bag, passport, cash, a prepaid phone still in its blister, a compact first aid kit. Beneath it, in a plastic file, a life insurance policy naming Cedar Path Fellowship as beneficiary in the event of my death. On a yellow legal pad nearby, a bullet list that included Mountain Road, guardrail, no witnesses. Items will be logged and preserved, Ruiz said after she ended the call. Cass's color rinsed out like paint in water. Her hands opened and closed around nothing. She said Reed prepared the bag, that she didn't mean the policy to be used, that she hadn't read the details, that all of this was contingency planning for terrible possibilities nobody wanted. The sentences piled up like sand that refuses to hold a shape. Ruiz nodded once, wrote, and did not editorialize. The law has its own weather. When it was time to go, the agent stepped aside for Cass to walk first. No cuffs on the porch, no spectacle, just the slow, careful drawing down of a curtain. She paused at the threshold as if she might say something shaped like, "Sorry," then didn't. The door took its time closing because old wood does that in March. I turned the burner off and let the kettle climb to a single clear whistle before the heat fell away. The kitchen smelled like steam and paper. I took out my notebook and composed 2 fresh lines. Cass, admission expected denials to route hospice bills. Field update, go bag plus policy naming Cedar Path, Mountain Road note. The graphite shone a little in the angled light. The room emptied itself of voices until only the clock spoke, unbothered by warrant numbers and manila folders. I stacked the guardianship packet beneath Marge's letter and set the warrant on top with its face visible. Then I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and listened for the sound you sometimes get after something breaks. Silence that reconsiders itself, chooses not to echo, and becomes stillness instead. The kettle's last warmth tapped the metal as it cooled, quieter than a gavel, loud enough for one man to hear. Pilar's conference room wasn't built for ceremony. Folding tables, a coffee urn, mismatched chairs, and a view of a parking lot where birds worked the grit for breakfast. It turned out to be the right room for what we needed, a place where harm could sit down and put names to itself. Father Michael O'Rourke arrived first, collar slightly skewed from a drive that looked like it had argued with his back. Gloria Benton from Spartanburg came with a manila envelope held like a fragile loaf. Arthur and Lila Monroe, married 54 years from Johnson City, took their seats hand in hand as if a sudden wind might otherwise separate them. I listened more than I spoke. Their stories drew the same map mine had: chapel streams on Sundays, a community trust that promised stewardship, small withdrawals that didn't feel small when the cupboard echoed, signatures that multiplied without witnesses, and letters that said temporary where the law said theft. Pilar wrote as they talked, not with the distant speed of a stenographer, but with the attention of someone carrying a chair for the next person. When the coffee went cool, she pushed to her feet and moved us from telling to doing. The cart she wheeled into Motion's Hour looked like a siege tower, binders labeled orders, freeze, service, evidence. The judge on the morning docket spoke in clipped beats that made the clock feel seen. Protective orders went down like fence posts. Asset freeze injunctions followed, and a rescission of the illicitly triggered POA for me, granted pending final, the word independent underlined in the court's own ink. I watched the clerk stamp each order and slide it to Pilar, who slid it to me, who slid it into the binder with the quiet relief that attends giving one's weight to a cane that doesn't wobble. The court also ordered an independent cognitive evaluation, which I accepted like a blood draw, not an insult, a proof. Dr. Kendra Bloom met me that afternoon in a clinic room that avoided the smell of antiseptic without pretending to be a living room. She asked for patterns and stories, numbers and names, and then something harder, how value becomes judgment when time leans on it. I found the tempo I used to bring to faculty interviews, steady but unhurried, and let her see what my mind does when it makes a choice. 2 hours later, she shook my hand and told me her report would reflect what she observed. Judgment intact, comprehension unclouded, capacity present. When it arrived in writing, the language was dry as flour and just as necessary. Competent. Evening pulled us into a conference call with the state DOJ, Agent Dana Ruiz, a prosecutor who preferred nouns to adjectives, and 2 forensic accountants who talk in arrows and boxes. Deshawn screen shared a flowchart that looked like a subway map, North Fork processing in Wyoming, a hop to an exchange, wallet clusters that fattened after every Sunday stream, sweeps timed to the benediction. He traced the money like a teacher guiding a finger under a sentence children have not yet learned to read. The prosecutor's summary fit the facts like a new gasket. Wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, false filings, and a racketeering theory worth exploring if the pattern holds across counties. We didn't forget the counselor's clipboard from the lunch. Pilar flagged the phrases on our audio. Just a screen, temporary, for safety. She wrote admissible beside each, then drew a line to guardianship petitions that had been prepared as if the answers were already known. Orders protect first. Apologies can wait, she said in a courtroom whisper that traveled down the wire to every agency on the call. Cass's cooperation arrived like weather you could smell before you saw it. With counsel present, she signed a statement that put nouns to what had been perfume. Reads roles, the script for community trust, the mechanics of split donations, and the way temporary stretched to cover months while accounts bled. Pilar reminded her cooperation wasn't absolution. I offered the only mercy I could live with, reduced exposure if she repaid what she withdrew from me, and testified whole and unembroidered about the structure that had recruited her conscience to its sales pitch. Pilar memorialized the terms in a proffer memo and slid it across for signatures that did not wobble. By mid-afternoon, the clerk's emails landed. Guardianship denied, POA voided, orders served. Banks received copies. My portals unlocked with the click of a password that now required the passphrase only Marge and I would know. Alerts were set to knife through sleep if necessary. I downloaded 6 months of statements and printed them in stacks that made the table bow a little. Then I laid out a ledger with dates like mile markers up a long grade and totals that proved a truth you could not outrun with adjectives. The DOJ called back with traction that sounded like gears engaging. A preliminary indictment framework was on the table. Restitution would run through seizures and insurance. Whitman Chapel was flagged for dissolution proceedings once the facts cleared the bar. I added a tab labeled Restitution and another labeled Eval and let the binder's spine hold the weight of the day without complaint. Night found me at the kitchen desk with the house breathing like a shoulder under a blanket. I filed confirmations, court orders, Dr. Bloom's report, bank unfreeze notices, Deshawn's diagrams. The pages made a sound like pages make, small, faithful, unafraid of ink. Somewhere inside the binder was the distance between love and shield, and I tried to keep my hands steady over it. The phone rang when the hour had too few numbers to share. Cass's voice carried static I could not blame on the line. She said she was pregnant. She said she didn't know whose. The words came out like a confession in a language that had cost too much to learn. Fear did what fear does, rushed ahead of consequences as if breath could outrun them. I kept my voice even because the quiver of a parent's breath becomes permission too easily. I told her she would be safe. I told her she would not be shielded. I noted the time in the log when we hung up, then closed the binder on a house that felt, for the first time in months, like it was not waiting to be taken. Outside, the mountains held their shapes in the dark the way old friends do, by memory and intention. The porch light made a soft circle that didn't pretend to be the sun. It was enough. Before sunrise, the Whitman Chapel parking lot held its breath. Sodium lamps hummed over empty stripes, and the foyer's glass doors reflected the shape of vans idling without headlights. Inside, the stage lights were cold. A banner that once read Open Hearts had been half-rolled for a midweek repaint and now sagged like a sentence without a verb. Evidence crates thudded softly on carpet. Blue-gloved hands taped door frames and outlets. A technician crouched at the lobby kiosk, pulled the power cord, and watched the donation screen fade from cheerful peach to obedient black. On the confidence monitor, the Mission Housing Campus pixelated mid-rotation and froze, a stock dream caught between angles. Across town, in a room with dry erase maps and coffee that had burned itself loyal, Agent Dana Ruiz ran the cadence. Wallet flow diagrams pinned to corkboard. Whitman Stream, North Fork. Exchange, wallets. Merchant IDs read out and checked off. A paralegal slid the last 2,703D order across a table where pins were arranged like instruments on a tray. Ruiz wore the focus of a person who knows a mislaid comma can set a whole day wobbling. She pointed, nodded, and kept the hour moving. At the chapel, an evidence team moved through the sanctuary with the low-gravity people bring to libraries. Tablets disappeared into bags, each serial read aloud for the camera. Make, model, ID. Seed phrase cards turned up in a pastor safe alongside old cufflinks and a letter opener engraved with a verse. External SSDS wore masking tape labels that pretended to be order where order had been pretending. In a storage closet, a printer still warm from last night's work offered stacks of glossy brochures. Smiling families, honeyed light, promises dressed as nouns. A forensics tech printed the stock image license and circled the vendor's name. The campus had been bought for $49 and a story. Reed Mercer answered the door of his condo in gym shorts, a band around his wrist tracking last night's sleep as if sleep could be counted like tithes. Agents stepped through with calm choreography. Rights were read in a voice that could have been a weather report. In a study across town, Pastor Joel looked up from sermon notes titled The Practice of Generosity and folded his hands on the desk while the cuffs waited on air. No raised voices, no righteous speeches, just the slow, practiced closure of loops that had been left open too long. In Wyoming, a compliance officer at North Fork Processing watched his screen flower with alerts. Ruiz's team sat on speaker while merchant accounts locked in sequence. Confirmation codes repeated back into the record. ACH returns queued where they should have lived in the first place. The officer cleared his throat and asked whether he should flag associated IDs for enhanced review. Ruiz's answer was a steady yes. The timestamp landed like a metronome tick on a staff that had finally found its key. By mid-morning, the arraignment courtroom flickered with flat fluorescence and the rustle of too many polyester blends. Reed and Pastor Joel stood at a rail that held more fingerprints than history books ever mention. Charges read clean and without editorial. Wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, false statements. The clerk's voice cut the air into measured pieces. Conditions followed. Passport surrender, no solicitation, GPS monitoring. Reporters lined the back row with legal pads that pretended paper could absorb more than ink. The defendants answered in syllables that didn't change anything. A joint advisory from the state DOJ and the U.S. attorney slid into inboxes while the news stations refreshed their scripts. The language named what the stream had refused to, an unregistered community trust. Sunday night crypto sweeps matching donation spikes, patterns designed to separate vulnerable seniors from savings. A hotline number waited at the bottom like a doorbell in a neighborhood where the porch lights had been off too long. Pilar's office, by contrast, smelled like toner and resolve. Cass arrived with counsel, eyes ringed like a night that hadn't ended, and signed a plea cooperation agreement that turned narrative into admissions. Restitution to me on a schedule that did not flatter her income. A sworn allocution that would say out loud what glossy brochures had implied without saying. Testimony against Reed and Pastor Joel. A bar against serving in any fiduciary role going forward. Pilar's warning wasn't performative. Cooperation is not absolution, she said, pen still uncapped. The first restitution confirmations moved through the day like small clear bells. Asset seizures and insurer subrogation put numbers back in boxes that had been empty too long. Father O'Rourke's check queued for release with a docket citation in the memo line. Gloria Benton's disbursement showed as pending, the word that makes patience a verb. Arthur and Lila Monroe's transfer waited for a second signature that would arrive before lunch. In my inbox, a message from the task force restitution pool arrived with a confirmation number I wrote twice on the chain of custody page. Not because I might forget, but because ceremony stabilizes memory. At my kitchen table, I closed loops the way teachers close windows before a storm. I attached exhibits to their proper tabs, the stock render license with its vendor receipt, the clinic doctor's payment ledger that ended the argument about independence, nonprofit lookups that read like a directory of places Cedar Path refused to be. Timestamps of Sunday night sweeps layered over donation spikes until the overlap looked less like coincidence and more like choreography. The binder's spine creaked under the new weight and then held. Near dusk, I drove past Whitman Chapel out of plain curiosity and something harder to name. Work lights glowed inside, colorless and functional. The glass door had a polite sign about suspended operations pending dissolution, a sentence that pretended gentleness while the screws backed out of the sign's frame. A city truck idled at the curb. Two technicians lifted the lightbox panel off its mounts and wrestled it into the bed. The last bulb in the word open blinked twice, then admitted it was finished. Home had its own work to do. I stood on the porch and read the restitution email again because repetition teaches truths better than novelty. I set the phone face down and let the mountain air move through the balusters. The chapel's marquee could go dark without my permission. My house asked for something else, a quiet insistence that light can be both boundary and welcome. I turned on the porch light and left it burning. Not a vigil for men who had used microphones to pretend they were listening, not a signal that anything uncomplicated waited inside, but a small architecture of clarity at an address I still owned. Across the street, Eileen Park's cat patrolled the curb as if order were a scent. Somewhere behind me, the clock kept time without favoring anyone. The day had taken things and returned others. I let the exchange stand without a speech. There are endings that demand applause and endings that reduce the room to ordinary breathing. This one did the latter. The chapel sign went dark, the task force kept the record, and the first checks moved toward hands that had earned their steadiness by surviving. On my porch, the bulb hummed a little and did its job. That was enough light for the walk between now and whatever Chapter 10 had the nerve to ask. The last restitution email arrived after supper. A plain subject line with a number that meant arithmetic could finally give up its seat to sleep. I printed it, set it under the restitution tab, and wrote a single line on the page beneath. Money returns what it can. It does not return the hours you guarded an empty chair. The clock on the wall did what clocks do when the hard part is over. It kept going without applause. I signed the boundary letter that had waited on my desk for a day and a half while I stared through it at the hill across the road. It said what I was finally able to say without shaking. Love is not a waiver. Contact goes through counsel until restitution and testimony are complete. No fiduciary roles ever again. Therapy strongly urged and not a shame. It promised safety for the child and named what safety is not. secrecy. I photocopied the letter for the binder, slid the original into a stamped envelope, and walked it to the box at the end of the drive. The flag went up with a small, satisfying clack. Ordinary mechanics can be a benediction. Cass wanted to thank me in person for not humiliating her, and Pilar found a way to make that both possible and bounded. 5 minutes in a supervised lobby with the recorder on. She wore a plain sweater and held a folder against her like an apology she didn't know how to deliver. "I'm keeping my appointments," she said. "I'll keep telling the truth." I told her she would be safe and not unaccountable. Her eyes flicked to the recorder, mine didn't. When time was up, I watched her go the way I once watched her step into a kindergarten classroom I trusted to teach her how to read. The feeling was similar and not the same. A week later, I stood in a community center room with a whiteboard and a coffee machine that made a noise like a broom in a corner. The sign on the door read, "Keep the lights on." 10-minute checklist. And the crowd looked like my town. Father O'Rourke in the second row with a legal pad, Gloria Benton with her envelope of careful papers, the Monroes sitting shoulder to shoulder as if a gust might still test their resolve. I passed out a single sheet. Beneficiaries, confirm in writing, POA, springing only with independent evaluation spelled in ink. Banks, flag, no relatives, set alerts, freeze unknown transfers, calls, record, texts and emails, screenshot and save. Nonprofits, verify 501c3 and Form 990. Beware community trust without registration. Beware Sunday night crypto sweeps. Passwords, passphrase only you and one trusted person know. Write everything down. I told them what a porch light is for and what a locked door is for and how those are two different mercies. I left a stack of copies on the table by the door and watched hands pick them up until the stack was gone. When the hour turned kind, I drove the Blue Ridge Parkway until the road admitted that beauty is sometimes a provocation. I pulled off at an overlook where wind combed the fir tops toward a single thought. I set Marge's photo on the warm hood, the cedar sachet beside it, and thanked her for the habit that had made a difference between a suspicion and a case file. If it doesn't fit, write it down. The mountains held the sentence the way mountains hold everything, for a while, and then without commentary. I put photo and Cedar back in my pocket, patted them as if pockets were reliquaries, and drove home. Housekeeping of the soul takes the same posture as any other. I brought out the fireproof safe, placed Marge's USB and letters inside, added an index card noting the box's shelf and contents, and turned the key until the tumblers sounded like confidence. The trunk in the attic went back to its corner with a tag on the handle that read, "Cataloged." There is mercy in labels. They do not heal, but they keep the stitches straight. I made a plain list in the binder, 2 columns, no flourishes. What returned, funds, dignity, competence affirmed, neighbors' quiet help, the law's spine, a path for others to recover. What didn't? The old ease with my daughter, holidays as unthinking rituals, the version of fatherhood that never had to say no twice. I accepted both columns and wrote beneath them, "A ledger is not a verdict, it's a record you can live by." Pilar called to note arraignment dates, Ruiz to say the hotline still rang every day, the AG's office to confirm the first dissolution filing against the chapel's shell. I thanked them without speech-making. The day contained more than I needed, and gratitude does not require exclamation points to be true. Back on the porch, the air carried the clean mineral scent that comes after a brief rain. I could see where the sign from the chapel had been, an empty rectangle on a building that was now a bare noun. Structure. A city truck hauled away the last panel that afternoon. The hole where the wires had fed the lights looked like a decision left open for a reason. Across the street, Eileen Park's cat requisitioned the top rail of her fence with the authority of a small general. I said my rule aloud because sometimes your own ears have to hear what your hands are already doing. Light on for truth and safe return. Door locked until trust is earned. It's a sentence I can keep. It does not require applause. It does not punish. It separates welcome from surrender and lets both be honest. Inside, I put the checklist file on a thumb drive and labeled it for the community center. If someone asks for the slides, they'll get a single page and the promise that a notebook costs less than a mistake. I slipped the last restitution confirmation into the binder and closed the cover. The binder did not feel like a weapon anymore. It felt like a well. Night arrived without drama. The porch bulb hummed its soft, steady hum. I left it on not as nostalgia for a building that sold hope on installments, but as a simple architecture of care for an address with my name still on it. In the living room, the clock kept time without worrying whether time is kind. On the kitchen table, the mailed letter's receipt dried to a paler blue. The house made its small noises, which is how houses tell you they are not waiting for the door to open to a surprise that will tip the furniture. Some endings swing shut, some end by remaining open enough for breath. Mine is the latter. The chapel's lights are gone. The mountain holds its line. A small bulb does its appointed work. I stand on the porch and let the circle of light name the rule I learned late and intend to keep. Love welcomes, boundaries protect. Writing it down makes both possible. Then I go inside, not because the night is dangerous, but because the lock is honest, and the light knows what it's for. In the end, the lights that mattered were not the ones that dazzled crowds, but the small ones we keep on purpose. Quiet proof that truth is welcome and boundaries are alive. Justice did its work, not with spectacle, but with patient records, clear lines, and the courage to say no until yes could be trusted again. Some losses don't refund, yet a steadier kind of wealth remains. The habit of writing things down, the discipline of staying kind without staying blind, and the understanding that love stands taller when it stands guard. Thank you for staying with this journey. If a moment here resonated, taught you something, or simply reminded you to keep the light on and the door locked, share your thoughts below. Your voice helps others find theirs. Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow more stories about resilience, accountability, and the everyday courage of setting healthy boundaries. Tell us what lesson you're taking forward, or drop a timestamp for the moment that hit hardest. If this helped, consider sharing it with someone who needs a steady hand.